Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to our live stream study hall. Very special guest today being interviewed by Peter Marks, Master of Wine, one of our instructors and partners here at the Napa Valley Wine Academy. So let me bring on Peter and our esteemed guest today. I'm going to let Peter Marks do the introduction. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hey, I'm great, Christian. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. Who do you have for
I
us
love.
today?
Well, we are really lucky to have a good friend of mine, Lisa Perrotti-Brown, who is the editor-in-chief at the Robert Parker, Wine Advocate, as well as robertparker.com. And Lisa, welcome.
Hey,
Yeah.
yeah, good to
Hey,
see ya.
we're
Good
just
to
on
see
another.
anyone.
And we're both here in Napa. I'm in the sort of on the north side of Napa, and you're down in Caneros, correct?
Yep.
Good. Well, thank you again. Do you know, I have to just start this off. Do you know when we first met? I was just thinking about that today.
No, I don't. I've known you for so long now. I can't even remember that
It
far back.
was, and I don't remember the year. It was in the early mid 2000s. We judged together at the Sydney International Wine Competition. That was the
Oh,
first time I met you.
did we do that?
Yes, this by anybody who doesn't know the Sydney International Wine Competition.
That
It's
was so
tell
much
tell us
fun.
so tell them a little bit what's so unique about that.
Well, it's a wine and food pairing competition. I did that for about 4 or 5 years in a row. I
Hmm.
love to do that. First of all, I have to say it's up in the Blue Mountains of Australia,
Hmm.
which is just a beautiful part of Australian mountains over Sydney. And it was just so fantastically run, where you would get wines from all over the world, but mainly Australia, and all of these fantastic, really good food dishes, and you would judge the wine based on how compatible it was with food. And
Right.
and I thought it was a really interesting exercise. And again, coming into what I would eventually get into doing, which is mainly reviewing wines and wine criticism. It gives you that perspective as well, because you constantly have to have in your mind that there's a whole bunch of purposes that wine serves, and you kind of have to hold them all in your mind when you're looking at wine and judging it, or evaluating it critically for a publication.
Right. Good. Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to give a little introduction as far as your background. And I know you were born in a rural part of Maine, but
Yep, out in the boondocks.
how did you move from some place in Maine to becoming the editor in chief and living in Napa Valley?
Well, I went to Colby College in Maine, and we had a junior year abroad program. I should say I studied English literature and performing arts at Colby, and there was a program where we could go to London and study for a year, mainly Shakespeare, but also acting courses and all sorts of English literature, basically. And I just fell in love with London. It is the first time, yeah, it was the first time I'd been out of America. But it was just like, everything that I'd read in books and everything just coming to life. And so as soon as I graduated from college, I wound up moving back to London with the idea that I wanted to be a playwright. And at that time, and this is in the early 90s, London, the theater scene in London was just so happening. It was just vibrant. There were lots of new playwrights and new theater going on there. And, I just wanted to be a part of it. Little did I realize that playwriting actually doesn't pay an awful lot. So I had to somehow pay the rent, and a friend of mine happened to be managing a wine bar in a really lovely area of London in Pimlico, which is not far from Scotland Yard, Westminster, all of that. And I started working there just part time. Knew nothing about wine. I didn't even know how many colors it came in. That's how little I knew about wine. At the time, all I did was drink Jack Daniels and Coke.
Okay.
So I slowly started learning. Okay, well, there's three basic colors to wine, and shades in between, and about I don't know, about a year, not even a year later, my friend who was managing the wine bar was leaving, the wine bar happened to be owned by a very big pub group. And they came and they interviewed people for the position. And, I just completely bluffed my way through the interview. I'm saying, yeah, I know about wine.
You don't do that when you write your reviews now, I hope.
No. Well, no, then, because I was talking the talk, but then I had to walk the walk, because I had to actually manage a wine bar when I got the job. So the first thing I did was I signed up for WSET classes, and I loved it. I'm kind of a dork. I love the whole academic thing as well as the whole tasting itself, and the rigor that comes with building your palate up and building your palate memory, which is probably just as important. And so I just took to it straight away. I loved it. And I, went through all of the levels of the WSET, did the diploma. And then, by that time I'd left the wine bar and I was working for a fine wine merchant there in London doing on-trade sales. And then, went through various positions in the UK wine trade. Started, doing my Master of Wine. And I mean, wow, what an experience that was as well, doing the Master of Wine, as you know, well. The people
So did you do that in London while you were living there?
I started it in London, yeah. But then not long after that, I moved to Tokyo. And I got a position as a wine buyer for a fine wine importer there, and still doing the MW, studying with the Asia students. And then I started doing, instead of the European program, I went on to the Australia program. Spent a lot of time in Australia because, eventually I would be moving to Singapore. I met Robert Parker. I wound up working for him, covering the wines of Australia and New Zealand. And, then kind of the rest is history. I just, it kind of went on from there. And I've been with the Wine Advocate now since 2008. So
right. So 2008 was obviously a great vintage for you.
It was the year I got
you
my
started
MW.
working for Robert W. You got your MW, right?
Yeah.
And you also were the
Singapore that year. So yeah, that was a big year.
that is great. Yeah. And you also won the Madame Boulanger Tasting Award in 2008. As the top taster of the year, which is
you did
and I
too,
think,
not that year, but
well, yeah, but that was like a lifetime ago. But you were the first female American to earn that.
Oh, was I? Oh, okay. I didn't.
Yeah, there you go. There's a feather in your cap.
I put that on my TV. Yeah,
so what happened? So how do you? Let me ask you, what is a normal day for you as editor-in-chief, if there is such a thing?
I keep hoping and praying for a normal day, when I can just sort of get into a little rut and just, because I'm one of those people, I would love to just do the same thing every single day, but it's anything but, it's really kind of triage from the morning. I go through the emails and see what's urgent. We publish every single week now. So we've always got, I'm looking at the back end of our website to see what's ready to publish and what we're going to come out with. And then, talking to our social media person about, what we're going to promote. And then, of course, the reviews as well. There's a lot of correspondence involved in setting up the tastings. Now, since we've been in lockdown, everything's been done from my home office here. So, it's just a complete sort of redoing all of the systems. And of course, talking to the reviewers, we've got 10 reviewers, including myself, and, all of us going through this kind of chaos at the moment, trying to, what we would normally do is taste mostly when we're visiting in the regions. Now, everything has to be done, get sent to us and done from our homes. So, but yeah, so the normal days, I have no idea what that means anymore.
Okay.
But there's a lot of juggling because I have the two jobs, the editor-in-chief role and the reviewer role for Napa wines in Bordeaux.
And how many wines would you taste, let's say, in a month?
Oh, well, we each publish about anywhere between 3,000 to 4,000 tasting notes a year. As a reviewer,
each editor? or each
each
right
reviewer.
reviewer. I mean, yeah.
Does that. So whatever that breaks down to. But then, I mean, you have busy months and you have not so busy months, and that really depends on the regions you have. So in June, because of what happened with the En Primeur campaign this year, it turned out to be a really busy month for me for tasting, as well as the end of March and the beginning of June, doing all of those Primeurs wines, barrel samples as they were coming in. So, then it wouldn't be, unusual to do 100 to 150 wines a day. On a normal day, it would probably be more like 10 or 20. But when you've got the peak periods, for example, I've got the Napa Valley Vintners tasting coming up soon, and those wines will need to be tasted relatively quickly. So I'll be back to the 100 to 150 a day.
How do you do that? I mean, I know I can taste 30, 40 wines at a judging, and there comes a break time and you take lunch, but by the afternoon I'm taking a nap. So
yeah, no, it's the mental strain more than the physical strain. The palate fatigue you can kind of deal with taking little breaks, making sure you're hydrated. You might want to eat. I know Bob Parker used to have like a little bit of rare beef or just roast beef in between some of the sessions, particularly with the big red wines, because it would help take the tannin buildup off, the proteins, combine them with the tannins, and it had a relatively neutral taste. It's the mental fatigue, because the way that I have to do things and our reviewers have to do things is that you pretty much have to write the whole tasting note verbatim in the first go, because you don't have time to go back and edit, given our busy schedules. So it's best, and that's where the fatigue comes in, because you need to sort of get it all out and make it eloquent and really make sure that you're capturing the style and the spirit of the wine, so that somebody who's not tasting it will understand what you're talking about when they go to read that tasting note. So that's probably the most difficult part. And when you're doing that for about 100, 150 wines a day, then you really get the sort of mental fatigue by the end of it. You're just sort of thinking, I can't even write a full sentence,
Yeah. So if
it,
you're doing on-site visits at a winery, you're again taking the time and writing your full note up at that point in time?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And it's nice. I've gotten really good at talking and typing at the same time.
Wow.
and typing, because you almost like, it becomes like a second nature writing the tasting note. It's more like translating actually than creating, because what you're doing is you're translating what you smell and taste in the glass into words, and so that you're not actually making this stuff up. It's just there. So as I'm going through, I'm thinking about, okay, all of these significant things in the wines that leap out at me, and how am I going to put that so that somebody can very clearly understand it. It doesn't need to be poetry. Sometimes it just comes out like that. The wine wants you to write something that's quite almost like a story, because the wine tells you a story. But most of the times it's quite straightforward. So you can actually, I found you can talk to a winemaker and taste at the same time, because what you're really doing is more of a translation exercise than an actual creating exercise.
Good point. Yeah. So sometimes do you struggle to differentiate between wines? I mean, I'm thinking if you're tasting over 100 Napa cabs in one day, I mean, there's got to be, sometimes you just want to say the same thing. Maybe, you have a hard time coming up with
and again, going back to Bob was a great mentor, because he would say things to me like, sometimes when you're writing these tasting notes, it's going to be repetitive, but don't make up crap that's not there. If it is repetitive, if you're getting, black currant, just say it. Thankfully, each wine is unique. There's always some little things in there, but there's some similarities as well, and you need to capture that too. So you don't, I sometimes I read tasting notes and I think that just doesn't sound, that's just too, airy fairy. It doesn't sound real. Those aren't, real things that, and I worry that sometimes people are making up these things that they're reading in them. I think you just have to call it as you see it. It's kind of a straightforward exercise. And then, on top of that, you get these experiences with these really incredible wines where they do almost tell a story, or they present a personality to you that's really exciting. And, you're not doing justice to the wine if you don't capture that as well. Is it, big, brawny and muscular, or is it really sort of flamboyant, floral and perfumed? You need to capture these because these are things that are going to help, again, communicate to the person who's not tasting the wine what it's like, and we'll say to them whether they'll like it or not. And ultimately that's on a very basic level what you're trying to do.
Yeah. So what happens if you have a wine that you really don't like? Do you actually write it up and publish it, or would you hold that
Yep.
back? You do.
Yeah, I mean, it's you have to, I think. If a wine has been submitted for review and things like that, sometimes if it's the wine that I've gone out and purchased, because not all of the wines that I review are wines that have been submitted. Sometimes I hear about a producer and I'll actually just go out and buy the wines and taste them. And then, if it turns out that those wines are really awful and they're a little known producer, or maybe they're just somebody starting up and they're, still kind of fun in a way, there's no need to crucify somebody like that.
Yeah.
Right. But if a wine sample has been submitted, particularly, or if it's a benchmark example that a lot of people know and expect to have reviewed, then yeah, I mean, you got to say it like it is. If it's not good, or if it's flawed, you gotta call it out and tell people. There's no point in only putting out glowing reviews.
Yeah.
That said, we do focus on wines that we recommend. It's supposed to be a buying guide.
Right.
Most of the wines that we're covering are supposed to be wines that we recommend that people buy. But of course, we need to have a representative sample of wines that people are tasting. So it can't just be all of the great wines. People, when they read about a vintage, say you've tasted, I don't know, 600 or 800 wines, sometimes more, from a region and from a vintage, they need to understand that, if all the reviews are good, they think, oh, this must be a really good vintage. So you need kind of to balance it out and say, well, actually, this was a patchy vintage. And, here's some examples of some not so good ones and what you can expect to see from the less positive wines. And then here's some example of some people who really, nailed it, got it right.
Good. I have actually a double question on the topic of objectivity. So the two parts, first of all, how do you separate your friendships with many of these winemakers, I'm sure, and owners that you've developed over the years? How do you separate that friendship from what you're going to write about them, particularly if you're not going to write a very nice note?
Yeah.
And then secondly, do you taste blind?
Okay, well, the first part, we all try to keep winemakers at arm's length. And I know that's difficult because, whenever you go on, a tasting trip to a region, you get invited to a lot of things. Some people, you just hit it off with when you're talking to them. You really sort of see things, the same way. That said, I mean, at the Wine Advocate, we actually have written into our contracts what we can and can't accept, and an impartiality clause basically that just says, you can't, obviously accept any gifts or gifts in kind or anything like that. But you also, you also have to keep people at arm's length. I think it's particularly for those winemakers for the regions that you're covering. And that can be difficult. For me, it's actually not that difficult. I'm not that social a person anyway. I kind of like to keep to myself and to my family, and I do have some close friends, but a lot of them aren't even in the wine industry. So yes, I mean, it's a dangerous game when any critic becomes really, really friendly with winemakers, because even if that winemaker is, one of the top winemakers and really, at the top of the game, and consistently produces great wines, there's going to come a time when a wine, just isn't all that. And you've got to, be brave enough to sort of just come out and say it like it is, with the scoring, with the description, because we don't work for wineries, we don't work for winemakers, we work for consumers, we work for people who are going to be buying the wines. We're buyer's guide. So yeah, that you can't even take that into consideration,
Right.
whether it's the owner, the winemaker, even somebody who just works for the winery. It's and again, coming back to Bob Parker, he did say to me, some of the nicest people make some of the crappiest wines. And some of the worst people you'll ever meet make some of the most glorious wines. And you know
That's
what? You're
funny.
just gonna have to call those wines like you see them, because
Yeah.
the as soon as you're compromised, your reviews aren't worth anything.
Yeah. That reminds me of a story. I'm good friends with Rob Davis, who just retired as a winemaker at Jordan, and he worked extensively with Andrei Chelichev and went
Uh-huh.
to Europe on many trips. And just like Bob was a mentor to you, Andrei was a mentor to Rob. And I remember one place where they rolled out the red carpet for Andrei, and lavish presentation and wines and food and everything. And Andre wasn't saying much about this wine. He was kind of like, holding his thoughts back. And finally, Rob, whispered to, Andre, what do you think of that wine? And Andre goes, it's a wine looking for a friend. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of those. If, the people
Yep.
were great, but boy, the wine wasn't. And so the blind part, do you taste blind?
I don't know.
Do any
And
wine critics taste blind nowadays? They don't really talk about
some
that
do, no,
anymore.
they do, and I'll tell you why. Obviously, the One Spectator, they taste blind. Publications like I believe the Wine Enthusiast still taste blind. James Suckling tastes blind. Anyone who accepts any form of advertising from a winery,
Mhm.
it's pretty much a given that they have to taste blind, because obviously, if they didn't, at least, dare I say, make a show of tasting wine,
Yeah.
then they could be compromised with their reviews. Obviously, if you're receiving money from a winery and that, then you might want to give them a better review. So yeah, there's an important point there for those publications that accept advertising or any form of sponsorship from wineries or winemakers. They really ought to taste blind, and most of them do. We don't. I do feel that as a wine critic, you particularly for something like the primeurs and things like that, you kind of have to know a little bit about the history of that wine, in order to kind of foresee where it's going to go.
Mhm.
And there's two reasons for that. Obviously, if it's not showing like you think it should, you could ask for another sample. And there's, particularly with the barrel samples that we do, there's every reason in the world why it might not be showing like it should. And the contrary is true as well. If something looks too good to be true, then you can question that. And oftentimes, we will go out and buy a bottle off the shelf, for something that looks too good to be true, or order a bottle from somewhere, to retaste it just to make sure that the two marry up. Because all sorts of things happen. But I do think that particularly when you get to the certain styles and certain circumstances of wines, it does help to have a little bit of history and knowledge with that vineyard, with that wine, to in order to be able to understand. And as a critic, you're putting this all together because not only are you writing a review just on that wine, but you're also looking to produce a report on a vintage and on a region. And
Right.
everything is like a little piece of the puzzle that you're putting together. And so when you're tasting one wine, you're saying, okay, that did that in that area, and that did that in that area. this all helps you, to put all of these pieces together and understand, exactly what Mother Nature was doing, and how different grapes were reacting, and how that had to do with vine age and clones and varieties and all of that. And eventually, after you get to, for me, it's always like I started out tasting the 2019 Bordeaux this year, and I'm like, I can't get my head around it. And there's always this like point, you're about maybe 60 or 70% of the way through your tasting, where you start to see what the picture is. And it's this wonderful moment when I think, yes, I can write a report now. But coming back to your question, it really, really is essential to know what those wines are, so you can put all of that together, because you're
give
not
good advice. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
That said, I don't. We have to be completely unbiased with our views to doing that. You have to have the knowledge and the courage that you're just as likely to give a bad score to a first growth as you are to a Cru Bourgeois or a fifth growth, and vice versa. So you have to constantly be, putting everything, all the history and everything of quality at least aside, and just saying, what did they do this year as well? And we love surprises. I love it when a fifth growth comes knocking on the door of a first growth. And again, you have to make sure that's what's really happening for something like that. Somebody who really, excels beyond your expectations in that vintage. It's worth going back, a few times and retasting and making sure before you go out on that limb. But you got to be brave as a critic. You got to be prepared to go out on that limb.
Okay. Speaking of the 2019 Bordeaux, since you've tasted quite a few, and there's for those people who are interested in Bordeaux, a nice buzz for the vintage. Number one, it seems like a very good quality, and number two, the prices have actually dropped for first time in memory, it seems like. So what is your sense about the 2019 red Bordeaux?
Oh, it's a vintage I personally like stylistically. It's got a lot of freshness to it. It's got a lot of crunchiness to the fruit. It's got a lot of energy. And I love all that. 2018 was also a great vintage, but it was much more sort of rich, big, bold, sort of seductive style, hedonistic style. Whereas as 2019 is a much more sort of elegance, a lot of perfume, a lot of finesse, great structures though. And it's really one of the things I love is the rightness of the tannins, the quality of the tannins for the top wines. And particularly for the Cabernet. And I say that because, Merlot, it's a little bit easier to get those really sort of plush, velvety, nice tannins out of Merlot. What's a little bit difficult for Merlot is to get the interesting nuances in there, which some of the best wines got. But for Cabernet, it can be a little bit difficult to get that real fine-grained, almost very tightly pixelated character to the Cabernets, and some of the best ones this year in 2019 managed to get that. They managed to get all of the bright, crunchy fruit, the freshness still in there. Alcohol's not too high. I was a little bit suspicious of some of the alcohols because everybody seems to be trying to, well, I won't say trying, but some of them were just above the 14% level, where the terrorists, don't kick in. But yeah, they a little bit, not overly high alcohols around really right around the 14 mark there for some of the wines. So really, it's nicely balanced wines, really, really drinkable wines. I still have a lot of barrel samples. And, this is another thing that kind of surprised me was the stability of the barrel samples. They obviously winemakers have been so reticent for so many years about sending barrel samples. And, in some vintages with good reason, because the wines can be quite fragile. But these seem to be really, really very sort of, steady, sturdy, stable barrel samples.
That's good to know, because I know some critics did not review the 2019s because they didn't want to taste them as you did with having samples shipped. They only would taste in person. But you found them to be, how would they ship? Would they ship full bottles, or what did they do?
Well, it was very interesting because everybody, it was all new for them too. And some people took some huge precautions. Some people, had ice packs around everything. Some people, I still have one of these, have these temperature monitors that followed, so that you could like plug it in and you could see what the temperature was throughout the journey. So there was, a whole variety of different means. Some people's samples took 2 days to get here. Other people's samples took 2 weeks. And those ones usually got, they were not tasted, just to be out of fairness. But at first I didn't want to taste, and it wasn't until I learned that the campaign was moving forward that I said, okay, I'm going to have to taste, because if the wines are out there and for sale, then our readership needs to make decisions on whether they're going to buy or not, and we need to be there. So I said, let's just try it. And I was completely prepared to not review the wines if they weren't in good condition. And there are a number of wines, even some famous names, where I didn't review because the sample that I got wasn't very good. One producer, Leaville Lescas, sent me samples 4 times before we got it right.
Okay, good. So do you have 3 favorites from the vintage that you're able to name?
3
Maybe high price, medium, and low?
Yeah.
Affordable?
Let me think. If I could, if money was no object, which one would I buy? What did I really love this year?
Or maybe a couple.
Yeah, I really, really love what Cause d'Estournel has been doing in recent years. And, Santa Steph, they had a little hiccup in 2015 because they got a little bit more rain than the other areas during harvest. But apart from that, they've just been doing great, great things there at Cause d'Estournel. But Santa Steph in general really has pulled its socks up. Used to be, considered this really sort of austere kind of, almost lean, green, mean, sector of the Medoc, or commune, I should say. But in recent years, it's really surprised me. I didn't get to taste, I should say, the Montrose this year. They weren't sending samples, so I am looking forward to tasting that, because I expect they did very great things there. They've been on a roll recently too. So I think if money was no object, I'd probably go for the Cause d'Estournel, just out of my own personal preference for style. I thought that was really stylish. For mid-price, do you know what I really was impressed with was the D'Armagnac and the Claire Millon from the Philippe de Rothschild stable. I thought these wines really did well this year. There were, a number of, fifth grows, and in particular some Cru Bourgeois as well, that did really well in the Medoc this year. And I made a list of those, but I think, of the famous names that are in that sort of more mid-price point, I would say, those are really, really good. Value wines, I did a whole section on value wines. What was my top pick there?
We just have to get a subscription and go online and look, right?
Well, yeah, because I did a special article on the top 25 wines under $35.
Yeah.
And there were some real finds there. And that was the other thing I suppose I should say about the 2019 vintage is that even at the lower end, there's some fabulous, fabulous wines. Whereas again, for 2018, by comparison, it was a little bit more patchy at the lower end, but 2019 was pretty impressive.
In addition to Bordeaux, you also are responsible for Cabernets in California, Napa, Sonoma. What else is your domain as far as reviewing and tasting?
That's it, really, well, I shouldn't say that's it. That's enough wines. That gets me to the 3,000 to 4,000 wines per year level. There's a lot of labels in Napa. I do some of the, yeah, as you said, the Cabernet-based wines in Sonoma. I also do make the trip down to Ventura once a year, and I did that recently. Actually, I went down to Sinaquanon and tasted with them, which is, I just can't, every time I come back from there, I just think, wow, these people are out, out there in terms of creativity, in terms of ambition, in terms of just, really taking Rhone varieties in California to a whole other level. But that report's coming out next week on that.
Yeah.
That's going on. And also, Manfred Son has come out with a new label as well called Fingers Crossed. So that's pretty exciting.
What is he producing under that label?
Same Rhone, emphasis on Rhone varieties, and in fact, many of the same vineyard sources. So they're sourcing some of their fruit. Sorry, I should say this is Nicholas Krenkel, using some of the Sinaquanon estate-owned sources, such as the Cumulus Vineyard, which is just down the road. I should say they are literally based just down the road from where Sinaquanon was, so it's easy to go to one or the other when you're visiting. Yeah, so using some of the same vineyard sources, Bien Nacido, which Sinaquanon has worked with for many years. They're working with that too. The Third Twin Vineyard they're working with. So yeah, pretty exciting. Similar vineyard sources, similar grape varieties, still working with the Rhone varieties, but a different enough style, I would say. Maybe a little bit more sort of, I don't know, maybe a little lighter touched, fresher. There's something so cerebral about Manfred's wines. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's something that's so sort of profound about them, and I would say maybe Nicholas's wines have a little bit more of a skip in their step, a little bit more lighthearted. But that's just tasting.
I'm sure we have some questions, but before we do that, I wanted to find out about a few of your likes. So first of all, your favorite wine region in the world, if you had to pick one.
Oh, if I had to pick one, oh, that's mean. But it would have to be probably Burgundy, yeah.
Okay. All right. Then I'm going to ask you a series of two options. You get to pick which one you like. And I think I know what the first one's going to be. So you ready to play this little game?
Yep.
Okay, Cabernet or Pinot Noir?
Oh, that is tough. That is tough.
You just said Burgundy, though.
I know, but yeah, I mean, Burgundy, I was thinking about the Chardonnays too.
Yep.
So if I only had one grape variety and I had to pick, I think I'd go for Cabernet.
Okay. All right. Instagram or Facebook?
Facebook, Instagram, definitely.
Okay. Riesling, Gruner Veltliner?
Gruner.
Muscat or Gewürzt?
Ooh, that's tough. I would say Gewürz.
Singapore or London?
London.
Sushi or steak?
Sushi. Good sushi.
All right. Sushi and Gewürztraminer, maybe. Rock or rap?
Oh.
Or neither?
Yeah. Maybe hip hop. Yeah.
Okay.
Not rap, but hip hop.
The beach or the mountains?
I think I'd be the mountain.
Okay. And one more just to see if you're my friend. Giants or A's?
I have no idea what that means.
I didn't think you would. They're baseball teams. No, it's just so you know.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. So let me ask Christian if we have any questions that folks might want to ask Lisa.
Yeah,
I have more, but
we actually do. We have Miles is asking Lisa whether on the 100-point scale when you're reviewing a wine, do you devote 10 points to ageability like Robert Parker did?
Ooh, 10 points to ageability. I think more than ageability, it's the ability to do something more. So I think that it's kind of the same thing, but a slightly different thing. That to develop into something more, because there's kind of a difference between a wine that will kind of just hold at this plateau for a long time and not getting any better, and there are plenty of wines out there that do that, and the wine that will develop into something more. I don't know that I devote a full 10 points to that, but yes, I think to get to that 90 point or above, it usually has to do, for me in my head, with a level of complexity that means that yes, with some time in bottle, that wine's going to transform into something different and something more. So that's a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Great, and we have another question about if someone was interested in making wine reviewing part of their career track, what recommendations and tips would you have for them?
Yeah, wouldn't everybody like to be Lisa? Taste 3,000 wines a year or more.
No. I think it's about making the exercise of writing tasting notes and scoring wines second nature to you. When I'm hiring somebody new, one of the first questions I ask them is how comfortable they are with scoring wine. And you have to. It's maybe one of the, well, it's not the most important thing that we do. I would say that there is an equal importance between the writing of the tasting note and the scoring of the wine. But you need to get that right. You need to understand where it sits in the context of not just its peers, but of the wines of the world as well. And so you need to work your tasting palate up so that you do understand that context. And then you need to also be able to apply that with consistency so that, this 95 point wine means the same as that 95 point wine, and there isn't a disparity. So yes, I think it's just getting comfortable with that, because I know that when I'm looking to take somebody new on, I'm looking for somebody who has a demonstrated track record of being able to do that.
Great.
Yes.
We have a question which is sadly apropos to what we're experiencing here in Napa today, and that is wildfires. With the recent wildfires in Australia and California, have you started to see wines appear with smoke affected by smoke taint?
Yeah. There's plenty of them from the 2017 vintage from Napa. And it's the first concern that I have, when I get up in the morning and I look out on the horizon, and there's smoke everywhere. It's rough. It's rough, but again, I have to think, I feel awful for the wineries and the winemakers, but I have to think on the consumer's point of view, because they're going to, likely be putting down a lot of money for this bottle of wine, particularly if it comes from Napa. How would they feel if they're opening the bottle and it's clearly a smoke tainted bottle? But yeah, it's a concern. And I know that 2017 caught everyone off guard here, and I know because I was tasting barrel samples with people, and people were confused. They didn't know what to do. They were getting results back from, analysis that were saying that, the smoke taint was below detectable levels, but maybe it was one day, but not the next day. I know what I can detect, So it's a really difficult call. I think, when quality is the most important concern of a winery or winemaker, that you have to sort of look at what you've got and say, look, if it's been exposed and it's possibly got smoke taint, or definitely has smoke taint, but you think it's below the detection level, maybe just don't use it, because it can be an issue. Sadly.
So we have one last question that I think we have time for, and that is, with your obviously you're one of the few people in the world who are able to try such a variety and sheer number of wines on a yearly basis. Have you seen any macro trends across the wine industry and in all the wines that you've sampled over your time?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest trends I've seen is with tannin management, and a real focus on getting the texture of the tannins right in the vineyard, and not trying to do that in the winery, or saying to customers, you have to wait 20 years for this wine to come around. And I think that's been if we just take Bordeaux as an example, and I don't think it's just happened in Bordeaux, but if we just take Bordeaux as an example, it's just transformed, the appeal, the style of Bordeaux. But I also think the user friendliness, if you can even use that term, of the wines. So, for example, you've got huge estates, sometimes over 100 acres in size, and having the winemakers, the vignerons, isolate these into parcels, really start to harvest parcels, manage parcels separately, getting the tannins perfectly ripe and bringing them in, and making them so that they're approachable when they're young. And this is not something that's being done specifically with the winemaking, but I would say, that there's a net movement away from what we used to call over extraction. I haven't used that term for some years now, because, winemakers know when to cut it off. It used to be like a bragging right, how long you've had your wine on the skins for, for several weeks. And now it's this sort of like, yeah, okay, we got to this point and we pulled it off because, that's when we started getting the harsh tannins, and that's what we didn't want, and maybe not using so much press wine anymore, really just using the best quality tannins. So I think that, that's one of the big macro trends is, making wines that have a great background. Because when you look at the numbers, the IPTs, the tannin volume numbers are still high. There's still a lot of tannin there. So I'm not worried, about how this is going to impact ageability. But the quality of the tannins is better across the board. And I think that that's an important movement for red wines, top red wines anyway.
Right.
Great news for consumers. So, Hey, Christian, I have one last question I would like to ask Lisa.
Please.
And that is, Lisa, what is something that people would be surprised to learn about you?
Oh, I think it's all. I'm a pretty private person. I don't know. What would people be surprised to learn
or interesting, something that's interesting about you?
Oh, interesting. Oh, there's nothing interesting about it.
I have something if you don't come up with anything.
Yeah, you do? Oh,
yeah. Well, you just told me about it the other
that?
day. You moved to a farm. You've got animals. Well, you had animals before, but I think you've increased your flock a little bit, right?
Yeah, we have. We've got 4 goats. We've got, I don't know how many chickens. We've got about 10 chickens. We've got 9 ducks. We've got 2 dogs, 2 kids.
There you go.
Yeah, we're
a full house.
The carnivorous farm life, yeah. And I've been, sorry, Peter, I should have told you, I've been making goat's cheese.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, we got to, next time we have that bottle of Bali together, you'll have to bring the cheese. I'll bring the wine.
That is something new and surprising, probably.
Well, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
I think this has been a great fun getting to know you. I'm going to give this interview a 99. It would have been 100 if we had more time.
99 plus,
99 plus, yeah. 99 to 100. There you go. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So generous with your time and great insights into a day in the life, as well as to all the wines you review. So we are very appreciative of you joining us today.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers.
Cheers.